Hello, my name is Corbin Irwin, and this is a presentation for CYB 610 at Grand Canyon University. Today we're going to be talking about several different topics. We're going to have some goals and objectives, one of which will be to enumerate and identify vulnerabilities in a Keyoptrix 2 machine using several tools such as NICTO, OWASP, and Nessus. We will be exploring these vulnerabilities and discussing how they can be exploited, and we can also discuss how we identify them using the tools. We will discuss how vulnerabilities are disclosed and the legal and ethical implications of this. So to start in our lab, we're going to talk a little bit about how we enumerated the Keyoptrix 2 machine, the vulnerabilities that we discovered, and then how we could possibly exploit those. Then we'll follow this with a discussion of several different tools as well as legal implications. To start out, we used our nmap command and targeted the IP address from 0 to 24 range, and we were able to identify our machine. If we take a look here, we can actually see that we were able to identify the machine as 192.168.56.109, and we saw several different ports, one of which for this lab we'll be interested in, which is the 3306 TCP, which is open and has MySQL. So going to the website, we can see that we do have a form available for the remote system administrator login. We're going to be looking into this a little bit more. We did look at some of the information available in the developer tool section on Firefox and didn't find anything particularly useful, but we'll come back to that. Next, we looked at services. So we used the services scan and we were able to see a little bit more information about what was available. We saw the Apache version we're running, OpenSSH, again, MySQL on this port, and some good information there. Moving forward, we did an operating system scan using the sudo nmap-o command followed by the IP address, and we were able to get more information. We can see that it's running Linux, and then network distance, we can see it's 1 hop, so there's no firewall in place between these two systems that we're scanning with and trying to target. Next, we did an intrusive scan. The intrusive scan gave us a lot more information, such as the SSH host keys, some SSV2 support ciphers, and some different information here. We can again see the MySQL. Not a ton of information here useful for what we're looking for, but we're going to continue on and try some other scans. Next, we use the nmap vulnerability script scan, which is nmap pn-script vuln. So it's using a script that uses the nmap command to specifically look for vulnerabilities. What we're able to find is several different vulnerabilities that are present within the machine and quite a bit of information about how these could possibly be utilized. Next, we used DIRB, another great tool to brute force directories. We used the DIRB followed by the IP address command, and that gave us several of the different directories on the actual machine. We can see some of these might be useful for different attacks. It just gives us kind of good information about how things are built, so we might be using that later. So, tools of the trade. Let's discuss this really quick before we move further. We are going to have a discussion between NICTO versus OWASP ZAP. These are two great tools. Both of them conduct web application security scanning. Both are open source, so that's great. They can be used for vulnerability identification. NICTO is a light application that runs from the command line, making it a quick, easy to use. It can also scan for many vulnerabilities, such as out-of-date software, cross-scripting, and SQL injection. So it's very easy to run, doesn't take much. You can run it on a very low-end hardware. It just is a command line application. Very accessible for most people and easy to use. OWASP ZAP is a more robust security scanning solution that provides customization and manual scanning features such as proxy intercepting and request editing. OWASP ZAP, it provides a graphic user interface that can make scanning easier for users with limited experience. So it's a much more turnkey solution. You don't have to know the commands, don't have to have a whole list of different scans you're using. It's pretty much plug and play. So we'll talk about that a little bit more as we actually use the tools, but we wanted to discuss some of the key differences here. So NICTO. We use NICTO to target our machine as well. Specifically, in our case, we targeted port 80 to get some more information. And here we can see some of the things that we turned up. We can see, for example, that there might be a anti-clickjacking frame that's missing. So clickjacking might be possible. We can see that cross-scripting protection header is not defined, so that might be possible as well within the machine. We can see that Apache is outdated, and we can see some different HTTP methods, such as trace that was allowed, several different possible problems, and we're going to discuss those further. Scanning with OWASP, like we said, it is a more turnkey solution, so here you simply put in your IP address and you hit attack. That gave us a ton of different information. It gives us a really great diagram of what possibly is going on, and they're categorized by basically a threat level, and here, or risk level rather. Here we can see one of the high risk ones is the SQL injection. We can also see absence of anti-CSRF tokens and several different ones, but we'll discuss those further in a second. Another tool that we use is Nessus. So Nessus is another scanning tool that gives us a lot of information. We're going to be discussing some of the vulnerabilities that it discovered. We targeted our Keyoptrix 2 machine, and as you can see, it came back with a ton of different vulnerabilities that are organized basically by PHP issues, HTTP issues, browsable directories, things like that, and then it categorized them. Very easy and accessible, makes every bit of the information very organized and very readable. So it's a great tool. So looking at our risk assessment, we can see here some of the top ones that it identified as far as vulnerabilities. When we look at threat level, several high ones related to the PHP vulnerabilities. So we'll talk about a couple of those. We'll talk about some medium ones. And we'll talk about some low risks as well coming up. So let's talk about some of these. Vulnerability number one, basically outdated PHP that allows CGI query string code execution. Risk of this is that this version of PHP could possibly allow a remote attacker to get source code. So using an attack that targets this version of PHP, you could possibly intercept source code. Vulnerability number two, another PHP related one. This actually has several different vulnerabilities that could be present because this is an outdated version. So when you're looking at PHP lesser than 5.3.11, there's multiple vulnerabilities that we can see here. Header function, not direct multi-line headers with QCR. So this gives us a really great quick look at all the different vulnerabilities. Obviously, in this case, it's a little bit easier to fix because of outdated PHP, but if you were scanning a system to get information, it's very easy to get all this information in one look. Again, we're at a very old version of PHP on the system, so when we're lower than 4.4.5, there's another vulnerability. The remote web server uses a version that could be affected by multiple different flaws. This one can be affected by several different issues, specifically buffer overflows, string format vulnerabilities, arbitrary code execution, and different bypasses. So you can look more into that, and we will look into some of those a little bit further. Another high-risk one that we saw was CGI generic SSI injection in the HTTP headers. This is a high-risk one, allows the remote server host one or more CGI scripts to fail to sanitize requests, and basically makes the system vulnerable to SSI injection. Browsable directories is another vulnerability. Again, we saw that kind of with our brute force method what we used with DIRB. It was able to identify a lot of the different directories. This could potentially give us information that would allow us to do some more reconnaissance and find other attacks or things saved on the website that we could access. So that's something to basically not have. It's a vulnerability for sure. The web application information disclosure, at least one of them, applications hosted on the web server disclose the physical path to its directory. So again, kind of related to the last thing we talked about, but you can see some of the actual directories can be exposed using commands, and that's something that you don't want as well. Clickjacking, we talked about that earlier. That was identified by our OWASP as well, so there might be the possibility of clickjacking. That's another vulnerability found within the system. This allows attackers basically to trick users when they access the site into clicking on things they didn't mean to. It can also be weaponized to do quite a load of different things or encourage them to download malicious software. Trace methods, this can be used, again, we saw this with a lot of our scans, that trace was a possible HTTP method. So disabling these would make the system more secure because it could allow them to access debugging web server information. The cross-scripting, because of the PHP version is so low, there is potential for cross-scripting vulnerabilities. I did rate this as a lower vulnerability as far as risk goes. And then our last one we're going to talk about is web server allows password auto-completion. So that is something you can disable. It could create problems if users are able to store their information. It just makes them more susceptible to getting their system hacked and losing their passwords, or the passwords being intercepted. So web server allowing the password auto-completion can be an issue as well. But again, this is rated as a low vulnerability compared to some of the others we discussed. So let's talk about some of these vulnerabilities. For example, what is CSRF? Cross-site request forgery, or CSRF, is an attack that targets web application users who are already authenticated or logged in. If a user is already authenticated in a web application, an attacker can utilize social engineering to get the user to execute actions that the attacker chooses. The end goal of this attack is to trick the user into executing unwanted actions in the web application. Attacks can trigger bank balance transfers, email changes, and other various actions using this method. So essentially what they're doing is they're creating a targeted link that allows the request to go to a legit application that they're already logged into, and it can execute several commands that the user may not mean to. So a single link, for example, could do a bank transfer, and so if you're already logged into your bank and you click on the link, it'll then take the cross-site request and basically forge the request on your behalf and move money. So these can be potential problems for sure, especially if you are vulnerable to them. Another thing that we saw was XSS, or cross-site scripting, is a vulnerability seen in websites or applications that allow for user inputs. If the input filters are misconfigured, attacks can then exploit the vulnerability to execute code. Code execution may lead to the website giving attackers access to user information, changing the website or application content, or even allowing attackers to take control. Attackers can utilize this type of attack to modify websites, trick users into downloading malicious files or stealing information. So essentially it's allowing them to do cross-site scripting to use user inputs to that aren't filtered properly to launch vulnerabilities and exploits. So let's talk about our specific system now that we've identified some of the vulnerabilities that we saw, and let's talk about our flaw hypothesis methodology that we're going to apply to this system. Our hypothesis is that during the Nmap and NICTO scans, port 3309 is open and the website appears to use an SQL database. Using OWASP-ZAP scan, the Captrix machine showed that it had a vulnerability to SQL injection attacks. OWASP was able to identify the successful injection of, when we look at this screen here, we can see this is what they used to verify that it was vulnerable. And then they told us where we could find this, which is right here. So on this web page in the query line, we were able to see that there was the possibility for an SQL injection. So based on this information, we hypothesized that SQL database is vulnerable and could be exploited to run arbitrary code or lead to arbitrary code execution. We can see again when we look here that our SQL port was open on the 3306 when we did our Nmap scan. So what attack vector might we use to actually exploit this vulnerability? So the attack vector in this case we saw identified earlier was here at this website. So when we go to the index.php page, we can see the remote system administration login, or a curiform. Using the injection vulnerability at this website that we identified during our OWASP scan, which we're using a slightly different one here, but using this input here, we are able to test to see if the system is vulnerable to SQL injection. When we actually hit login here, we realized yes, it is, and it gave us the welcome to the basic administrative web console, ping a machine on the network. Okay, cool. So we got something to happen. It is vulnerable to at least some SQL injection. So we found that in our misconfigured curiform. Next, we decided that we are going to test this to see if arbitrary code is possible from this administrative web console. So here we did a cat index PHP and basically pinged the machine. What we got back was these results, which showed us that arbitrary code is possible. We are able to enter in commands here, like a command line, and get back some results. So we can further explore that as a vulnerability to see if that will lead to further privilege escalation and access to the system. But that's the attack vector that we are focusing on based on our hypothesis. So what causes SQL injection? What are the root causes? In this machine, the vulnerability was found within the curiform at the index.php page. This curiform was misconfigured and allowed for injections to be submitted to it. Additionally, the admin panel allowed for arbitrary code to be executed. So neither of these really were properly sanitizing user information inputs. So SQL injection vulnerabilities are caused by the improper sanitation of user inputs to the SQL database. When user inputs are not validated, inputs can manipulate the SQL queries to access or modify data that usually would not be able to. Another root cause of SQL vulnerabilities is missing access control. Poor access control policies will allow user accounts to access systems information that should be protected. Lastly, SQL injection vulnerabilities can be caused by dynamic queries and non-parameterized calls. So there's several different things that are going on to having a fully successful SQL injection. What it really comes down to, though, is not properly sanitizing user inputs and filtering them, which allows us to then, as we saw, put in several different things within the actual input curiform and get results from the database itself. So let's talk about legal, ethical, and industry considerations for vulnerability disclosure. There are many different considerations to examine when we're looking at vulnerability disclosure. One of the factors for disclosure is if you're working officially for an organization or as an independent. So if you're doing independent pen testing. Working independently, bounty programs and private disclosures are often the accepted way to go. So what you typically would want to do is try to keep vulnerabilities quiet and let the organization know they exist. If they ignore communication, there may be a time for a full disclosure when you completely release the vulnerability out to the public to allow them to know that it's there and that it's an issue and that the organization itself has not communicated with you. There's no legal obligation to do this, but ethically it's the right thing to do to allow people to know that there may be a chance that their information is susceptible to vulnerabilities and the company is ignoring it. If the company does get back to you, often we let them take over and process the disclosure and information their way. Once a company has information about vulnerabilities, it may disclose information about the issue in a security report after it has been patched. So typically they'll patch the issue if they can. If it's a huge problem, there might be a 0-day release or something like that. If it's something that's being actively exploited, just so people are aware of it. The legal obligation to disclose vulnerabilities depends on if it has been exploited. So when you're looking at a vulnerability, if it's someone's actively using this vulnerability to exploit a system, obviously there's going to be a change in how you're going to disclose things. If user information is compromised, disclosures are legally required to those impacted individuals. When successful attacks or breach are attached to the discovered vulnerabilities, companies have a legal obligation to disclose that information. And we can see kind of our ISO standard here that talks about when, how, and all of those different considerations for vulnerability disclosure. I personally believe that all vulnerabilities should be disclosed once they are no longer active. Sharing information with the rest of the industry allows systems to be more secure and minimize the impact of cybercrime. Granted, if it's a proprietary system, that'll change slightly too. If you have a disclosure of a vulnerability that you've found in-house, no one has exploited it, it's not necessarily something that needs to be disclosed. But if it's a disclosure within another system that might be used within the industry as a whole, disclosing that will allow other people to secure their system and protect the users, the economy, and other things like that. So that's kind of the ethical standpoint I take on that. Often there is no legal obligation to do these disclosures, but I think it is ethically the correct thing to do. These are the references that I use in our presentation today. I hope you all have a wonderful night.